Welcome to War Bios, where we delve into the most pivotal conflicts in history, and I'm your host, General Biography. Today, we're going to explore one of the most decisive battles in American history, the Battle of Appomattox Court House, which took place on April 9, 1865. This battle marked the effective end of the American Civil War, as Confederate General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant's Army of the Potomac. This campaign had devastated large swaths of the region, leaving countless civilians without food or shelter and crippling the Confederacy's ability to wage war. Meanwhile, Grant's army had been locked in a brutal siege of Petersburg, Virginia, since June 1864, with both sides suffering heavy casualties in the trenches. Lee's army, once the epitome of Confederate military power, was now dwindling in numbers and morale. The soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and demoralized, their bodies worn down by months of relentless fighting and privation. Despite these challenges, Lee remained a formidable commander, his strategic mind still sharp and focused on finding a way to turn the tide of the war. In February 1865, Lee was appointed General-in-Chief of all Confederate forces by President Jefferson Davis in a desperate bid to inject new life into the flagging Confederacy. However, it was too little, too late. The Union Army had gained the upper hand, and Grant's strategy of relentless pressure on multiple fronts was taking its toll on the Confederacy. Lee knew that he had to act quickly to save his army and the Confederacy, but the options were dwindling fast. As the spring of 1865 approached, Lee devised a plan to break out of the Petersburg siege lines and march west to join forces with General Joseph Johnston's Army of Tennessee, which was operating in North Carolina. The goal was to create a new, unified Confederate force that could challenge Grant's army and potentially change the course of the war. It was a bold plan, but one that required precise timing and coordination. In late March 1865, Lee launched a series of attacks on the Union lines at Petersburg, known as the Battle of Fort Stedman, in an attempt to weaken Grant's grip on the city. The battle was fierce and intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Although the battle was a tactical defeat for the Confederates, it did manage to create a temporary diversion that allowed Lee to begin his withdrawal from Petersburg. As Lee's army began its march west, Grant's army gave chase, with the Union cavalry under General Philip Sheridan taking the lead in pursuing the Confederate forces. The two armies clashed on April 1, 1865, at the Battle of Five Forks, where Sheridan's troopers decisively defeated a combined force of Confederate infantry and cavalry. The loss at Five Forks was a devastating blow to Lee's plans, as it denied him the use of the Southside Railroad, a critical supply line that would have allowed him to sustain his army on its march west. With his options dwindling, Lee was forced to consider alternative routes and strategies, all while being pursued relentlessly by Grant's army. The Confederate soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and demoralized, their bodies worn down by months of relentless fighting and privation. Morale was at an all-time low, and desertions were on the rise. The Confederate Army, once the proud defender of the South, is now a shadow of its former self, while the Union Army, bolstered by its recent victories, is poised to deliver the final blow. The fate of the Confederacy hangs in the balance as General Lee and his men prepare to face their destiny at Appomattox Court House. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the weight of unspoken defeat, as if the very fate of the Confederacy hung precariously in the balance. On April 8, 1865, Grant's cavalry, under the indefatigable General George Custer and General Thomas Devin, intercepted a Confederate wagon train near Appomattox Station, capturing or destroying many of the wagons and further crippling Lee's already strained supply lines. This decisive blow forced Lee to reconsider his plans as he realized that his army could no longer sustain itself in the field. The next morning, April 9, 1865, Lee's army formed a defensive line near Appomattox Court House with the intention of holding off the Union forces long enough to allow the bulk of his troops to escape. However, Grant's army was too strong, and the Confederate lines were soon breached. As the Union infantry poured through the gaps, Lee's men began to falter, their spirits sagging under the relentless pressure. It became clear that the battle was lost, and with it, the last vestiges of hope for a Confederate victory. In a last-ditch effort to turn the tide, Lee ordered a counterattack by General John B. Gordon's corps, but it was too little, too late. The Union lines held firm, and Gordon's men were repelled with heavy losses. As the reality of defeat sank in, Lee knew that his only option was to surrender. He sent a message to Grant, requesting a meeting to discuss terms, and the two generals agreed to meet at the home of Wilmer McLean, a local resident who had unwittingly found himself at the epicenter of history. As Lee waited for Grant to arrive, he paced back and forth in the parlor, his mind racing with the weight of his decision. He was a man accustomed to victory, not defeat, and the thought of surrendering his army was a bitter pill to swallow. His aide, Colonel Charles Marshall, later recalled that Lee's face was grave and solemn, yet calm and unruffled, as if he had steeled himself for the task ahead. But beneath the surface, Lee's emotions seethed like a tempest as he grappled with the consequences of his actions. When Grant arrived, the two generals sat down at a small table in the parlor, surrounded by their staff officers. The atmosphere was tense but respectful, as if both men were aware of the gravity of the moment. Lee asked for generous terms, hoping to secure the best possible deal for his troops, while Grant insisted on unconditional surrender. After some negotiation, they reached an agreement, and Lee formally surrendered his army, marking the effective end of the Confederacy. As news of the surrender spread, the Union soldiers erupted in cheers, their voices carrying far into the distance, a jubilant cacophony that echoed through the streets of Appomattox. The Confederate troops, on the other hand, were left to ponder the consequences of defeat, their faces etched with despair and disillusionment. For many of them, the war was finally over, but the struggle to come to terms with its aftermath would only just begin. They wandered the streets, dazed and disoriented, unsure of what the future held or where they would go next. The days that followed were filled with a sense of uncertainty and unease as the Confederate soldiers struggled to adjust to their new reality. Many of them simply sat down on the side of the road, exhausted and demoralized, wondering how it had all come to this. Others, however, began to make their way back home, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they would never again fight for the cause they had once held so dear. As one Union officer observed, the Confederates were a beaten and demoralized army, and they knew it. The war was finally over, but its legacy would be felt for generations to come. The surrender at Appomattox Court House marked a turning point in American history, as the nation began the long and difficult process of rebuilding and reconciliation. In the aftermath of the surrender, Grant's army began the process of disarming and paroling the Confederate soldiers, allowing them to return home on the condition that they would not take up arms again. It was a generous terms, one that reflected Grant's desire to bring the war to a swift and humane end. As he later wrote, "I felt that the rebel armies were whipped and that they would be ready to surrender if given the chance." And, with the surrender at Appomattox Court House, that chance had finally arrived. As the days passed, the Confederate soldiers began to disperse, returning to their homes and families, forever changed by the experience of war. The Union Army, on the other hand, remained in Appomattox, ensuring that the terms of the surrender were upheld and that the Confederacy was truly defeated. Grant's decision to offer generous terms had paid off, as it helped to bring a swift end to the war and pave the way for reconciliation. As the Union Army oversaw the surrender, they were met with a mix of emotions from the Confederate soldiers. Some were relieved that the fighting had finally come to an end, while others were bitter and resentful. One Confederate soldier, who had fought bravely throughout the war, was seen weeping openly as he surrendered his arms. "I never thought I'd see the day," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "We fought for what we believed in, but it seems that belief was misguided." Such scenes were a poignant reminder of the human element in warfare, where soldiers on both sides were driven by a sense of duty, honor, and conviction. In the months and years that followed, the nation began to rebuild and heal. The Battle of Appomattox Court House marked a turning point in American history, as it brought an end to the Civil War and paved the way for the Reconstruction era. As historian James McPherson noted, the surrender at Appomattox was not just a military victory, but a moral one, as it marked the defeat of a society built on slavery and the triumph of a nation dedicated to freedom and equality. The Reconstruction era, which aimed to establish civil governments in the former Confederate states and ensure the rights of formerly enslaved individuals, was a complex and tumultuous period. However, it laid the groundwork for the long and difficult journey towards true equality and justice. Today, the Battle of Appomattox Court House is remembered as a pivotal moment in American history. The site of the surrender has been preserved and is now a National Historical Park where visitors can walk in the footsteps of Grant and Lee and reflect on the significance of the event. As one visitor remarked, "Standing on the grounds where the war ended, I felt a sense of awe and reverence for the men who fought and died for their beliefs." The park serves as a poignant reminder of the human cost of war and the importance of understanding our shared history. That's all for today's War Bios. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, I'm General Biography reminding you to keep marching toward victory.